Well, I had an interesting event occur this week. I don't know whether any of you guys have had one of those moments when your life flashes before your eyes. I did. I found that my life was rather boring. But I did also kind of have the same thought at that moment when these things were happening faster than I could process them, that, oh, this is going to leave a mark. And you know, me being the bastion of patience that I am, was not happy about the fact that I'm going to have one more mark. I'm getting older, and these marks are ganging up on me, and it's like I'm tired of having these marks. And then I visit people like Pete, or Ben, or Jimmy, or some of the others of you who have had marks on your life for quite a while, and I think, why am I whining about this? There are so many people who have gone through so much more than myself. I got no reason to whine about that, but I can understand that sense of, you know, when is this going to end? And of course, when we think of that, normally we have that myopic view of this particular instance right now that's impacting me, wherein my life is flashing before my eyes, or where some traumatic event is occurring to me, and I'm thinking, well, I need to get rid of this. It needs to be over right now. And it's going to be over one of these days, sure enough. A great deal will depend as to where we go after this, or what happens after that, as to how we live today. But what a lot of folks don't understand, and what we as Christians ought to understand better than anybody, is that's what we are born for. Now, I know, as I've said before, suffering is a hard thing to talk about and to sell Christianity with, but we are intended for that purpose. That's what it says. It's a manifest evidence of the righteous judgment of God, that you may be counted worthy of the kingdom. Look at verse 5. Our worthiness of the kingdom is directly related to what we are willing to suffer for our Christ. And He being our example, what do we have in Him as an example of what needs to be suffered? Well, He went to the cross for you and I. He died for us when we were not capable of fixing ourselves, and He died for us in the sense that He did what we could not possibly do. What are we able to do then? And so when we look at suffering, and when we look at the struggles we have in this life, those things that happen and occur in our life that leave a mark, how should we view it? Well, there's several things brought out in this passage that are not brought out in many of the others. There's many passages in the Bible about suffering and struggling. I mean, we're studying in our Bible study, which Barry is conducting on our Sunday morning service, in 1 Peter. There's a text that's about suffering. And yes, he did trod all over my sermon again this morning in his Bible class, but it was a good Bible class. But the whole point being, yes, that is how we are judged worthy as to whether or not we are going to be pleasing to God, and that He will give us a home in heaven with Him, what we're willing to suffer. Now, of course, what goes along with that, because this is not just a standard sermon on the fact that we need to be ready to suffer. You know, I think Shane's life is going to pass before his eyes after this assembly, possibly. But anyway, that's a perfect song. Hate to admit it, but it is, because we ought to be ready to suffer for Christ. But be willing to do whatever it takes, because we understand a few things. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this text that's pointed out that is not in many others is our attitudes toward those who create our suffering. Because very often it is the case, and this could include anybody from those closest to us to those we don't even know, strangers off the street, who create circumstances that cause us to be suffering, persecuted, cause problems for us in our lives. What's our attitude toward them? And ironically, probably, it's very often those who are closest to us that create the most grief. Now, I say that with great caution, as my wife is in the audience, but nevertheless, she would tell you that's the case concerning the way I treat her sometimes. It's those who love you most sometimes who sometimes cause a great grief, and I would assume that is in part because our expectations very often are set in an unrealistic way. I always talk to young couples. They're about to get ready to get married, and I try to help them out. And of course, the first thing I say, really think about this. And it's not a negative, you really need to think about this. But one of the greatest detriments to young married couples is unrealistic expectations. I mean, and I've said this in the sermon, which got tickled, but everybody but the groom and the bride got tickled anyway. But I said that this is not Cinderella, the princess, and this is not Prince Charming. This is two people who came from different backgrounds and different homes, and y'all going to get together and you are going to learn the definition of compromise. You're going to learn what it is to not get what you expect and how things ought to go. And that's kind of a shock to young folk. Now, some of you that's been married, I think some of them's approaching 70 years, isn't it? Somewhere close to that. You could probably tell them a little different about how that works because you've been there, done that. But you know, how we view those who hurt us is brought out in this text, which is kind of interesting. Because a lot of texts don't include that. But it talks about in verse 4, Paul said, y'all really doing a great job. He said, one of the things that is self-evident about the suffering you're going through is your patience and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations that you endure. I have studied sociology and studied people for a long time, and one of the things I discovered about social circumstances, and really the definition of what is or is not civil, very often has to do with the patience we have for someone who is not pleasing us at the moment. You know, saying things, doing things that basically is going to leave a mark, and how are we, do we need to fix that right now? And we need to do things right, say things right. But how do we view them? Well, the way it looks like down here, we're supposed to understand that that's what we're given to, because we're going to try to live the Christian life, but we are going to suffer, and that's what it says in verse 5, to be worthy of the kingdom. And here's the thing that really catches in this particular passage. In verse 6, it's a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who trouble you. Now let me bring out a couple of things about that. The first one is Romans 12:19 that was quoted in our Bible class this morning. It is not incumbent upon us when someone does us harm or wrong or does something we don't like to get back at them. You know, the old adage these days is we don't get even, we get ahead. It's the vindictiveness that our culture has grown to at this point in time. That's not a Christian attitude. As a matter of fact, it's not our place to do that. It says it's a righteous thing with God to repay. Vengeance is mine, Romans 12:19. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. It is up to God to take care of these things on several levels, because number one, I am not God. That's an obvious, Captain Obvious, right? And so therefore, I don't know all the details of whatever transpired to cause me the grief I feel that I am being suffering. And so therefore, what I have to understand is God knows all the details of it, and if there is some retribution to be meted out, He will do it, and He'll do it in His good time, and He'll do it properly. You see, very often, I'm afraid, when we begin to avenge ourselves, when we begin to respond and react in an unchristian manner, when someone does us wrong, we end up having fodder for apology. That's basically all it comes to, because we get outside of our operating procedure and we take on those qualities that we think are God-like and become a judge and a jury when we have no right to be that. One of the ways in which we must deal with tribulation is to understand, number one, that is the way our life is supposed to be. We are going to suffer tribulation. But number two, when we do, okay, because anyone desiring to be godly, according to 2 Peter 5:10, I lost the verse, 2 Peter 3:12, if we're going to be godly, we're going to suffer persecution. But the second point is, we should not seek revenge in any way, fashion, or manner. Striking back is the way people function today in our culture, and that should be a place where you and I, as Christians, shine like the daylight. It ought to be so obvious when someone says or does something to us that leaves a mark, that we do not get so upset about it that we lash out and strike back. That is not the Christian way of doing things. Now, grant you this, it's the natural response for most folk. As a matter of fact, and of course I probably told this story before, but one of my favorite dogs, Tip, a long time ago when I was a kid, got into a porcupine. Now, y'all are very familiar with what happens to a porcupine, particularly when a dog gets into it and his nose gets hammered. And he had porcupine quills all over, and me being a 12-year-old, oh, I love my dog loved me, and I wanted to fix him. By the way, very often it is the case when we try to fix something and we're not qualified, we don't fix, we make it worse. Isn't that the case? So I sat down with old Tip and I reached over and I started pulling a quill out, and the first one he let me get away with. The second one, he bit me. And then he immediately started licking where he bit, because he didn't hate me, it's just that I was not helping him. And what I was doing I was not qualified to do what needed to be done. And so I left him be because he bit me. Of course, the quills come out, you know how that kind of story goes. But we're not qualified to do God's job. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. He will repay. We need to leave the repayment up to Him. And when we have been done wrong, now I'm not saying we ought not to protect ourselves. There's a text over in Matthew 25 or 24 that I think is quite interesting. It's kind of the basis of the castle law. If the master of the house knew that there was going to be an intruder, one of the translations says he would have prevented him. It's the idea that you have the right to protect yourself, but what we don't have the right to do is to go in and decide, I need to fix you, and I'm going to do it in such a way that it looks like it's revenge, it's avenging what you've done to me. We have no right to do that. That's kind of unique in this particular case here, because this text is saying you're going to suffer. In fact, Paul really builds them up and encourages them in verses 3 and 4 about how great they are doing with their patience and their long suffering. But what he adds to that is, you don't strike back. Christians do not strike back. The other thing is, and this is the struggle that we have particularly in our instant gratification society, the idea that I want everything that I want and I want it now, okay? And anytime you don't get it now, something is wrong, it's too late. And I'm just as an aside, I find it is the case with some of the older folk I run with. And you know, I don't like being around older folk. I just hang around them because I feel younger. But nevertheless, I hang around a lot of old folk in the church here, and they're good friends, and I hang around them, and they have lots of wisdom to give me. But I have noticed that older folks seem to have more patience than I do. Not that I'm terrible, well, I am terrible with my patience, but they have a lot of patience. In part, I believe, because they have lived through some things to see the end of something. I'm discovering that about myself. Maybe you are too. As you live longer, you're not quite as impatient. You anticipate some kind of conclusion, but it doesn't have to happen right now, because, you know, there was this other thing back in my life that happened, and then later on, something happened that came to fruition because of that, and so that I can wait. I can be more patient. It is the case that if we're going to be patient about things, the Lord will take care of things. He says in verse 7 that the Lord is going to recompense those who need it, that tribulation, that He's going to deal people that have given us problems, okay? And give you who are troubled, in verse 7, rest with us when the Lord is revealed from heaven with His mighty angels. I so look forward to going to heaven. I look forward to seeing Jesus come in the clouds in the air. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 through 18 has a great description, and it's great for those who are ready. Once again, this is a matter, you know, when you have that life flash before your eyes, you look at your life and say, well, is this a life ready to leave this earth? And of course, very few of us really are ready completely and totally, saying, oh yeah, there's so few like Stephen. There's so few like those in Revelation. Come, Lord Jesus. I mean, they were going through persecutions. It was interesting in the military when I was in the Navy in boot camp. You were never ready for inspection. You never told the senior chief when he came in to look at your barracks you were ready. You're never ready. You're standing by for inspection, but if you thought you were ready, believe you me, he could find something wrong. And by the way, that precipitated throwing your bunk off the side of the cliff throwing the sheets in the air and putting most of your locker in the trash can. I don't know why they did that, but it was very effective to let us realize we're never ready for inspection. We're standing by. Well, that's the way we are today. I mean, nobody's ready to die and go, but we are standing by because you know what? We're still here for a purpose and for a reason. And because I'm breathing, because you're breathing, God has something for you to do yet. So in that regard, we need to have patience, but also we should anticipate Christ's coming. In fact, we should look forward to the day when he does come. And looking at some of the people I hang with, like Pete and Jimmy and Ben and some of these older people, I told this to Ben the other day, I don't want to get older. I'm watching the way you struggle to get around. I'm watching the way you struggle to get up, and I'm starting to do that, and I don't want to get worse at it. I'd rather the Lord come now, but you know what? I'm grateful that he has patience with me. The Lord is long-suffering, not willing that any should perish. You and I are still breathing because God has something for us to do. So we're standing by and anticipating when he comes. Now here's where it gets kind of straightforward. Because God is going to come in vengeance. He's going to come in flaming fire. It's interesting very often when the Bible speaks of judgment, it uses fire as the analogy, as the illustration of how that judgment's going to be. And fire has two purposes. It can hone something, it can purify something like a metal. We do that very often. You purify metal by melting it down, taking the dross or the stuff that's not pure off the top, and then by the time you pour it out in the ingot, in liquid form, and it forms up in a little ingot, a little bar, then it's pure, whatever it is, gold, silver. In my case, when I'm making bullets, it's lead. But you get it pure, and that way it works really well for the job it's intended, and has really more value because all the trash has been taken out. So fire can have that impact, and that's kind of the suffering that we go through. It's compared to fire, a baptism of fire, actually. When we go through suffering, it makes us stronger. It makes us better. But the fire he's talking about here is not that. Because when this fire takes place and he comes here with vengeance, there's no do-overs. There's no second chance. No mulligan, as they say in golf. Corby and I know where that goes. There's no mulligan. You're done. And this vengeance is going to be a fire, as Mark puts it, where the worm doesn't die and the fire is not quenched. That is a horrible picture to think of when you think about your eternity. And you know that eternity is based on whether or not you're willing to suffer for Christ, because that makes you worthy of the kingdom. And you're not going to get back at somebody. That's not the way we do. Christians don't do that. They don't do it in physically, particularly. That'd be horrible. But you certainly don't do it in word. That biting back, in fact, backbiting is condemned by the Bible. And that's what's going to dictate, because we'll be judged by our works. That was brought out in our Bible study this morning. And being judged by our works, what we do, what we say, how we respond to people, needs to be something we think about before we just blurt it out. Especially when we're in pain, like old dog Tip. Pull a thorn out of his nose. His first response is to bite me. His master he loved. Yeah. And so we've got to be careful how we jump to a conclusion. But I want you to know the two categories that are there. And we don't want to be in any one of those categories. We want to be that suffering servant like Jesus Christ was, that is leaving to God the vengeance that's going to happen to people. Because when he talks about it here, there's two categories: those who do not know God, those who do not obey the gospel. Now, when you look at the one that says those who do not know God, let's understand that it's not talking about individuals who are ignorant in the sense that they don't know because they can't know. Okay? There are children who cannot know God. They don't know God. They cannot conceive of abstract notions. The very concept of love is a cookie from the cookie jar. Grandma loves me because she gave me a cookie. That's about the only thing they can relate to. But as we grow older and we mature and come to an age of accountability, it is time for us to know God. And Jesus said, if you seek me, you will find me. There is no excuse for anyone on the planet who doesn't want to know God. And by the way, the nature that people can see out here screams God. The heavens declare the glory of God, Psalm 19:1 and following. Therefore, if you want to know God, you can. But if you don't want to know, and by the way, this is talking about that rebellious mind that says, no, because I understand who God is, and He will require of me something. That's that one talent guy that said, I know you're a guy that just, you get in stuff that you didn't plant yourself. Well, yeah, that's what stewards do. And so he buried his one talent, and he was condemned for it. We don't want to be in that category. The individual who knows God will hold us accountable, so therefore, if I don't know, I'm okay. Plausible deniability, that doesn't work. No, we need to seek the Lord, that He may be found. We need to study. We talked about that in our Bible study this morning. We need to study to show ourselves approved. All of these things has to do with an attitude of wanting to know our God and wanting to please Him and to give Him glory. The other category is just as rebellious as those who do not obey the gospel. They know what to do and refuse to do it. Now, the way it's described here is an everlasting destruction. I always like the English thing, the way English terms are used, because when it talks about these two groups and the avenging that God is going to do, notice in verse 9, they will be punished with everlasting destruction. I get tickled at fellows who want to argue the idea that, oh, there's really no hell. You're just going to be totally destroyed and go out of existence. Well, that phrase doesn't make sense then if you look at it from just the standard definition of terms. Because if destruction is complete, you go completely out of existence, what's everlasting about it? As a matter of fact, if you look at Matthew 25:46, you will find that eternal and everlasting, and I've said this before, I don't know why the translators use two different terms, because it's the same Greek term, eternal and everlasting. Jesus says people are going to go to two places. There's no third option. Everlasting punishment or eternal life. That's the only two that's there. That's it. So this destruction that comes upon people is going to continue to be a destruction that continues and continues and never ends. It's everlasting. Now you tell me, what kind of vengeance or avenging could you do that would categorize yourself in the same category as how God is going to take care of those who persecute you? In fact, it ought to change your mind about those who persecute you. Instead of being angry with them, might I suggest that we feel sorry for them, pity them, where they're headed and what's going to happen? Shouldn't we rather, by our suffering and our persecution, knowing there is a day of the Lord that's coming, when the saints will be glorified, but those who have disobeyed Him will not be. They're going to something everlasting that is likened to fire. Shouldn't we do everything we can possibly do to help them get away from and get out of that circumstance of lashing out at somebody and trying to hurt somebody? You know, when somebody says things to me, my first thinking in my mind is, oh, that was rude. And the second is, yes, I could say something rude back to them that would be Christian, so I'm going to refuse to do that. But the third thought I have, and I recommend you to have this one, why did they say that? What pain is going on in their life that would cause them to be mean to somebody else, particularly for no cause? What's happening in their life? What marks have been on their life, that thing that happened to them that left a mark that we don't really understand, not like God does, that causes them to be this rude or disrespectful or ugly? What caused that? What might I do or say that would help their life be better and glorify God? You know, this text here is not just about suffering. It's about our being ready to put up with anything so that somebody might get to heaven. And how we respond is how we can help them get to heaven. You certainly can't do that by striking back, verbally or physically. Can't do it. It's just not a Christian thing to do. One of the hardest things for us to do is to cast aside that instant gratification urge to satisfy ourselves, whether it's pride or physical pain or, go on and on about what goes wrong with us, and realize I'm here to glorify God, and how can I respond in this situation where God will be glorified, and somebody will realize I got to change myself, because here is a light of goodness and righteousness and love. That's who we should be. This text talks about suffering. There is no doubt about it, and that's what we're given to. That's who we became when we decided to become a Christian. But let me tell you, there is a purpose and a role in suffering. It's not just being, it's not like somebody gives you a hard time and you just push your chin out and throw it up and they want to choke you. Go ahead, do it. That's not what this is talking about. Okay? Not at all. I know there are even religions that go door to door hoping that you will slam the door in their face, because now I feel righteous and I feel justified because you rejected me. No, that's not what this is about. It's about trying to figure out, what happened in their life that I can help change so that they go to heaven with me. How we suffer, how we are ready to put up with what we put up with, is a direct reflection on our Christianity and on our God. We can either glorify God or we put him to shame by how we respond to suffering and hard times. We're all going to have hard times. We're all going to get a mark every once in a while. Things are going to happen, and all of a sudden, that's going to leave a mark. But how we respond to it, that's what's key. As Christians, we need to respond in a Christian fashion. If you're not a Christian this morning, we always offer an invitation song so that you can become one. If you are a Christian and have not been doing that in your response, one of the greatest things you can do is, when you have responded wrong, go back and tell somebody, I'm sorry I did that. That was the wrong thing to say or do, and I want to make it right. So let's get along again. Let's understand that I recognize where my Christianity failed. Help me be better as a Christian. I will help you to become one, or to be a better one, so that we can all go to heaven. If you need to respond in any way, we invite you in the song.